Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa. Welcome back to the Better Sex Podcast. So glad you are here with me. This is my first recording in 2021. Not quite sure when it gets released, but I've been off for a couple weeks and I'm back in the groove and ready for a new year of interesting guests to have on the show. Today, I am talking to Maci Daye, and she is a sex therapist and an author and a retreat leader focused on almost exactly the same kind of work I do with couples all the time, right? In my private practice or in my online course. She uses different language or different ways of describing things, but we are so on the same page about so much of this. So it was really fun to talk to her. Her theme is awakened intimacy, which is about mindfulness in some ways, but about showing up for sex and paying attention and using what happens to either increase your passion and presence and pleasure or for healing and growth when there are challenges, which is just so important. You know, challenges in sex are basically inevitable when you're with somebody for a long time. We're going to hit bumps. We're going to have things that don't meet our expectations. We may get triggered based on past experiences. Whatever it is, there is an opportunity to transform that. So she's here to talk about awakened intimacy and to talk about some of the suggestions and processes she uses with couples. And I hope you get a ton out of the interview. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So Maci, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
There is so much to cover with you, so many concepts, but I thought we could start with just the idea of awakened intimacy, because that sort of seems like the foundation of what you're talking about. How do you define that? Why is that your topic? Why did you write your book on that?
Yeah, thanks. Those are great questions. Essentially, awakened intimacy is a path and practice for couples who want to use their erotic relationship for healing and growth. So, when we think about having sex, most of the time we're imagining that we're going to experience pleasure and satisfaction, which is a reasonable assumption.
Right.
And when we're with someone for a long time, we often do have those experiences. But as often as you well know, we have experiences that are confusing or confronting or triggering or aversive. And with this one kind of limited notion that sex is supposed to be about pleasure, it's so easy when those kinds of alternate experiences start to happen increasingly when we're with our long-term partner. We naturally start to wonder, well, are we having the wrong kind of sex? Is it me? Is it you? Is it us? Because it used to be so easy. So I view challenges that we encounter as A, being inevitable, and B, as an invitation to grow into our fuller selves. So if a couple is willing to expand their notion of sex to include this huge range of experiences, but if we distilled it down, pleasure and challenge, joy, and to some extent suffering,
right?
This life is this package. then we can work in tandem. We can say, okay, let's fast track our growth by using the erotic portal as a transformational path. And that's essentially what awakened intimacy is. And I got into it because I have a background in mindfulness and somatic psychotherapy, and this notion of waking up as we work through our challenges as a mindful team just kind of evolved fairly organically.
So it sounds like, I guess I have so many questions now. So it sounds like this awakened intimacy process is more on the challenge side. So if people are having pleasurable sex and it's working and this isn't being triggered, that's less about what you're writing about or focused on,
Well,
right? Your work is.
I think that's an easy assumption to make. There was an article in Spirituality and Health magazine on my book recently, and the woman wrote, like enlightenment, only naked. And I love that. And like no marketing person could ever come up with such a tagline.
Right.
So if you think about, many of us are meditating not just because we're miserable and trying to figure out like how to cope with all the challenges, but because we want to be more self-aware, more compassionate, more loving, have more wisdom. That too is part of awakened intimacy. So it's
Yeah.
not just for people who are struggling.
Okay.
And there's always more that we can open up to as we start to look at, well, what's starting to shut me down, or where am I inhibiting an aliveness, even if our sex is mostly fantastic.
Yeah.
So it does turn an eye towards suffering to normalize that. That's like the entry point for some people. But even people who are having a great time and just, they're growth oriented and want to know, how can that serve my awakening, work for them as well.
Okay. And then it also seems like, and this is something I agree with you on, but it's like if you run into struggles in your sex life, it's not like, oh, we need to go fix all that or deal with that somewhere else, and then we'll come back to sex later. It's like sex, right? The connection with our partner, that sexual activity and experiences are part of the process, right? We can use what's happening there.
Well, I would even go so far as to say that the same issues that are playing out in other parts of our lives play out on the erotic stage. So we can actually start to see our life themes and our limiting beliefs and so forth. So it's not that these are two separate parts of our life experience. We bring ourselves into every experience. And in fact, the notion of awakened intimacy is, well, yes, you can spend your lifetime becoming more conscious as co-parents. There's so many ways that we can wake up. But since sex is most likely what got you together, and it's such an important part of the human experience, why not then say, yeah, let's start now. Let's start now. So I agree. I think you've even quoted the line that, we used to think if the relationship was good, the great sex would follow. And we now know it doesn't work that way.
Right.
You can be close, connected. You can repair all of the trust breaches. You can start to recover safety. You can open your heart after having years of resentment. You can love, cherish, honor, respect your partner, but that doesn't translate into I want you now.
Right.
So I agree. We don't have to wait to take care of all the other stuff.
Yeah. And so how does awakened intimacy differ from mindful sex? I mean, that, I guess that's starting to be a term that some people are hearing, right, and using. So what's the difference between mindfulness and awakening? Or is it just another word for the same thing?
Somewhat, but not exactly. For me, mindfulness is the tool and the mindset that we can use in service of our awakening. So I'll say a little more about that. A lot of people, you're right, it's a term, right? That's sort of going into every pocket of life. And in the sexual arena, some people think, oh, I guess this means like slow sex, like slow food, that movement.
Right,
Or
right.
I guess it means like we're using practices to transmute sexual energy in some way, or delay ejaculation, or have full-bodied orgasms, as in some neo-tantric practices. And the fact is that mindfulness is simply a quality of attention that is present, curious, and exploratory. And we can bring that quality of attention, that attitude, into any kind of sex that we're having. Now, in terms of the awakening part, we know that you've, in fact, interviewed Lori Barrato. You know that mindfulness in sex can restore genital health and sexual functioning. And we know that mostly from research at the University of British Columbia, that people who literally felt nothing after gynecological surgery now can feel sensation and pleasure, that it enhances lubrication, desire, arousal, orgasmic potency. It can delay ejaculation for people who have early ejaculation. That's fantastic. You've got me, at World
Right.
One, at Word One. That has not much to do with the way I defined awakened intimacy. So mindfulness can also just enhance pleasure because in training attention and telescoping in on the quality of sensation, we become more sensitive to subtle expressions of energy as it plays through us. And that is the enhancing pleasure side of the passion and presence, which is my umbrella practice side of the equation. It can also help with sourcing novelty because most couples complain, as you well know, that when they've been together for a while, there's no mystery.
Right.
And when they're looking to spice things up, they turn their attention outward and start to scour the sexual marketplace for new thrills. Like, let's find another technique or a toy or a position or some games we can do, all of which are fine. But we can actually work with our consciousness to discover something new every time we make love, regardless of how long we've been together. Now, in that process, which is also being wakeful, like I'm going to actually see what I can discover in the familiar, is on the way to the next level, which is starting to use mindfulness as an awareness practice where we start to see some of our automatic patterns at work.
Mm.
The original intention of mindfulness was not to reduce stress and enhance productivity. It was to be in the fullness of life rather than in kind of a trance on automatic, and to meet life directly
Mm-hmm.
rather than to see things as we are, that famous expression, as opposed to how they are.
Yeah.
Since we have all these internal models that are shaping what we see, and these now hardwired habits that are essentially running us in the bedroom. So when we're wakeful during sex, we can start to notice those things and potentially change or certainly interrupt some of those patterns because we have more space, and then we're free to make different choices. We can also use mindfulness to access what I call the sexual operating system, where we can start to work with what neuroscientists call our early emotional learning, which are all the experiences we filed without conscious processing that then encode as beliefs and models that are steering our adult behavior, including our bedroom behavior. So if we go back to this idea of awakened intimacy, instead of having our programs run us, we can actually update the operating system by starting to integrate new experiences, which actually shift some of those patterns so that we have a different way of opening to Eros and our partner and ourselves and ultimately to life. So it's kind of the long game and sort of a kind of a bigger orientation than, you know, can I just source a little more excitement and satisfaction right now? Although
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. So what does this look like for a couple that maybe is really, having some serious challenges in the bedroom? Something's getting triggered, whether it's past trauma or these patterns, or is there a process people work through in this to approach this? And, what does it
Yeah,
look like? Maybe some examples or something of the kinds of things people might
sure.
take on and how that healing would look.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, first of all, there is a whole set of practices that are all based on mindfulness that have to do with how we research some of the experiences that we're having and start to work with some of the memories we might access or repair some of the wounds that we've experienced along the way. And because this is a partner practice, instead of just making this a solo journey or something I do with my therapist individually once a week, we hold this assumption that we're likely to run into something when we make love, that rather than skirting that or seeing that as an impediment to sex or an unwelcome intrusion, that we, in a sense, desensitize our fear of hitting those sensitive hot spots because we know we have an agreement to stop. So there's a 3-step process that I start with couples, which is stop, study, and share. And so stopping is really the opposite of soldiering through,
Right.
or of which so many of us, right, in
Yeah.
this
So many people
culture
do
are
that.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, which only, as you know, reinforces the avoidance
Yes.
cycle
Right.
because we're stepping over ourselves and it's not going to go well.
Yeah.
And then we're now filing that experience in our archive and anticipating that. So, hence, that whole cycle continues. But if we stop at the earliest sign of shutting down, starting to disembody, starting to feel angry or scared or self conscious or not fully present or constricted or having some kind of, we're noticing we're really like fast inside or our heart is beating.
Yeah.
All the kinds of signals that some kind of activation is happening, and we pause. Then we can spend a little bit of time regulating, but we can start to research what's going on. And the good news is this is what I try to impart. Really, the only place to heal a past wound is in the present. And we can only heal what's visible. So if we have some skill and we have this collaborative agreement that we're going to shift gears from making love to doing something reparative, and we start to team that way, then we're again not avoiding and afraid of what we might encounter because we discover often that when we give ourselves permission to check in and something arises like a memory, or we start to recognize, even if it's not a memory, like, wow, I think I'm really afraid of losing control. Like, I'm just afraid if I surrender into this experience, that this growing intensity, I don't know exactly what will happen. We're starting to divert from our little safe routine. And I feel that I'm putting the brakes on and I'm clutched and gripped. That's huge to
Hmm.
notice all that. It's even bigger to name that to your partner.
Yeah. The share part of this, right? The
The
third
share
step.
part
Yeah.
of it, right? And if it's met with curiosity and care, as opposed to, oh, that again, or
Right.
wow, we were so close to having something great, if
Yeah.
not for this. But there's some appreciation that there's some kind of relic coming up that we can respectfully study. Then we can go the next step, which is to make an adjustment. And usually people are silently suffering, managing their experience experiences, and maybe later they might say, wow, that was kind of intense, or that was hard, or I noticed
Right.
I was sort of putting the brakes on, but we're not in it together. So if we have this shared understanding that we're going to pause, we're going to study, we're going to share, then we can together figure out, well, what do we need to do? What would give you a greater sense of control or safety right now? Do we need to pause and breathe together? Do we need to slow down? Do we need to shift positions in some way? Do we need to stop doing that activity and come back to something else? And if it's not this, rapid fire interrogation, but an actual receptive curiosity, and someone can really mindfully check in, we almost always find that there is an answer, there's
Mhm.
information, there is a response to that question.
Yeah.
And the more we're listening and the more we're fine tuning and making these adjustments, then we're having a better outcome. Now we can, and I'm not going to go into it now, just I think for the sake of time, even go a step further and co-design an experience that's a corrective or do-over to something that went wrong in our past.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very slowly. So now we're not making love at all. We're now on a totally different track. This was the thing that illuminated, like I sort of talk about it as the illuminating power of Eros
Yeah.
to shine a light on something that maybe is ripe for healing. And we can do some kind of a do-over or corrective that, with the help of mindfulness, we wire in. And we know this is called self-directed neuroplasticity. Rick Hansen talks about it. Others in the field talk about it. So this is how sex can be this path and practice of both experiencing more pleasure, opening up to new experiences, and also safely starting to recover access to our erotic potential by meeting everything that's in the way with loving kindness and care and skill.
Hey, we're taking a real quick break here in the middle of the podcast, and I want to share with you a free resource. If you are in a relationship where sexual desire has been an issue, where one of you wants more sex than the other, where one of you or both of you are struggling to feel desire for sex, this is the training for you. It's a free webinar that you can watch on demand. It's called How to Want Sex More, or Help Your Partner To, without feeling pressure or obligation. In it, I cover the 5 biggest mistakes that keep people stuck, blocked from their sexual desire, and it's going to give you ways to approach this differently to start to create a sex life that's really fun and easy for both people. You can sign up at intimacywithease.com/masterclass. All right, so I have 2 questions. Well, I've got lots of questions, but 2 that come to mind first. For the person that maybe is getting triggered and having this challenge, assuming it's one person, how do you help them, or what do you advise for people that are like unaware of their experience, like so used to soldiering through, powering, tolerating things, pushing through, that they're not even seeing the signs? Right? Like what are the techniques to start to be like, whoa, here's a line where I should stop?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that's the norm.
Yeah.
Unless someone has had a lot of, personal development work, they are mostly oblivious and living from the head up and outside in images of what we're supposed to be doing without checking in, without feeling what's happening in my experience from one moment to the next. So it's a great question. So an exercise that I recommend to all couples, and I do in my retreats, is whether you need to stop or not, set a timer. And you can decide, with your phone, is it 45 seconds? Is it a minute and a half? Is it every 2 minutes? And both partners pause. And in the pause, they both get mindful and they check in to notice what's happening in their felt experience. And by that, I mean, what sensations can they detect? What emotions can they notice? What kinds of thoughts are they having? Essentially, what's happening in this now moment? And that's a whole skill into itself. There's the skill of stopping, the skill of noticing, and then the skill of reporting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Putting words sometimes requires learning a whole new vocabulary.
Right.
But it's so worthwhile because if I can report on what's happening in me, then I'm less apt to sound like I'm blaming you.
Yeah.
If someone said something, if they in the heat of the moment used a word that's offended me, and I'm suddenly like, that was a game stopper for me because I'm not turned on anymore. I'm annoyed.
Yeah.
If I say, you did that thing, and why did you use that language? I hate that. That's whatever.
Yeah.
That's not going to invite exploration and curiosity. But if I can go, whoa, let's hit the pause button, or maybe we have a signal, and I study and then I report, wow, there's this judging part in me that's kind of ready to make you wrong. But what I can feel is some shame is coming up for me. And I feel really exposed in this moment and a little titillated. But another part of me is sort of judging me that I like that, but I probably shouldn't. And so this is such
Right.
a
Right.
wonderful moment to stretch out
Yeah.
together
Yeah.
and meet and explore. But you're right, it takes some practice.
Yeah. And then I'm thinking about the other side of the equation for the partner that maybe isn't having this challenge and perhaps is just feeling frustrated and impatient and why do we have to keep stopping and how do you talk to that partner about invite them into this process which is going to be slow and gentle and metered and potentially not as air quotes here, sexually satisfying in the short term. Right.
Yeah,
Because I'm just picturing all the clients I've worked with, and some partners would struggle with this. Plenty wouldn't,
absolutely.
but some really would. So how do you talk to that
Yeah.
person about really, coming into this process with their partner?
Well, I think this is so important because sometimes we privilege the experience of the one who's experienced more wounding, possibly abuse in their life. Just like, the person who is the lower desire partner or the no person has a lot of power.
Yeah.
We tend to organize around the one who is getting more triggered. I take the approach that this is a couple's dance. We're both in this together. And so one of us is having this experience and the other is having this experience to that experience. And they're both important and they
Hmm.
both need to be included. And we can use the same skill set to research what is coming up with me and to learn to report on that, like some sense of my needs don't matter, or I'll never have what I want, or
Hmm.
a feeling of abandonment.
Yeah.
Like we were in this together, and now that you're triggered, I can't quite find you. You've sort of left.
Yeah.
And something about that harkens back to or evokes in me what I call a legacy state. So it's sometimes about sex itself. Like, darn, I really want to get off here. And
Yeah.
we're not quite getting far out of the gate when our first stop is happening. And that's something we have to work with because that's a genuine experience. Again, I would say that sometimes the meaning we put on that has little to do with sex. And if it is something around abandonment or my needs won't get met, I don't matter somehow. I grew up in a family where the squeaky wheel got all the attention, and now I have to be the generous hearted, easygoing, low maintenance human. That we get to work with that too.
Yeah.
Like, how
Yeah.
could we experience a moment of connection? How could you get your need met right here? in a way that allows me to respect my limits. Like, this is the whole idea of the collaborative thing. Usually, what couples do, again, as you well know, is they get into a fight about it or a power struggle and they disengage and everybody's miserable, as opposed to, wow, this is one of those moments that's delicate for both of us. I can say, though, I've seen time and time again, because I've had a lot of couples with that kind of polarization
Mm-hmm.
who, once they start sharing ownership of their erotic life, and there's some sense of, you're not the problem, you're not the patient, but this is our journey together.
Yeah.
That it takes so much pressure off the other partner that instead of being in this defended, protective state, some of their armor comes down and they start to open up and they start to actually have more satisfying sexual experiences as a team.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for addressing that, because I just think that'll be a common question to this. It's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
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 So
important.
what is the Eros cycle and erotic attunement, right?
Well,
Those go together.
What's cool about this is you're taking us to the side of the joy and potential of sex. And, all of those sex can be so many things. So, as you well know, even couples that have a great time in bed still start to have rather scripted sex, whether it's their own, well, we found these moves that are great. And so we repeat them every time, and you'll come and I'll have an orgasm and we'll be happy. But it's still kind of limited because either we're going on automatic and defaulting into these pleasurable routines, but they're not generating something new. They're kind of limiting. Or the kind of sex that we're having has been informed, and this is true by and large for all of us, from the outside in, by the images we've seen, by other people's definition of sex, by the moves that we're mimicking that we've seen on porn or in a movie or read about or somebody told us about. So it's not so much an inside out authentic pleasure pathway that's attuned to the erotic thread that's unfolding within and between us moment to moment. So erotic attunement, which is what a lot of couples come, longing for when they come to passion and presence or awakened intimacy retreats, is this idea that we're making something up in every second, that I'm feeling into me. And as I feel into me, I start to feel into you, and we're in some kind of resonant field. And I start to notice some impulses that are arising that may not look like anything we've ever done or anything I've ever seen before. And I feel free, because this is a mistake-free zone, to follow my impulse. And that calls a response up in you that may be entirely unscripted, so that eventually we're in this improvised kind of call and response. And the Eros cycle is a little bit of a cheat sheet to help us do that, because nature kind of abhors a vacuum. And people are like, okay, if we're going to have goal-free sex, if we're going to diverge
Tell us
from
the
our
directions
script,
about how to improvise.
What do we do? Right, exactly. So, before we even start the cycle, I use the metaphor of going into the dark, which is where we delete, to the extent that any of us can, our preconceptions, our history, our images, our expectations, so that we are in an anything is possible state of mind, which mindfulness
blank slate,
helps.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So from that, E stands for embody and attune, where I'm actually, which, we sometimes require a transition from an outwardly fast, task-oriented day to locate ourselves inside ourselves again. And mindfulness can serve as a transition. And then we do this kind of attunement. And then R stands for we begin to relate, relaxing our goals. And that may be we just look at each other, might be we hold each other for a moment, we feel each other's hands, So we're coming into connection. And the O stands for opening to impulses and new directions. And the S of Eros, Eros, is about savoring pleasure in small and big ways all along the way. Now, back to this notion of awakened intimacy, most of us are going to have some trouble at some point along that cycle,
Yeah.
like just landing inside ourselves and feeling our body can be a challenge for some of us. Or we may have the impulses, but trusting them and feeling safe to express them or to respond fully may, we may run into a snag there. Relating, we're so used to that entranced form of sex where we're going into our private bubble and feeling sensation, but to actually key off of each other can be a stretch for some of us. And of course, many of us have barriers to receiving
Right.
and actually experiencing pleasure. So we could still look into that and stop and start over and explore and do all of that in the Eros cycle, or we can just run through it and have a great time.
Is the arrow cycle, is that approach, that improvisational attune, let's see where we want to go? Would you say that's only after we've healed some of these triggers and challenges, or is this actually part of what a couple could do right when they keep encountering those difficulties?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would say it's something they can do right away.
Yeah.
Because if anything, because we have these models of sex, and I love your image to the playground. Just go to the playground and, we can sit on the bench or we can go into the sandbox or we can go down the slide. We can just look at other people having fun. All of it is okay.
Right.
But
Right.
most people enter with this preconception, oh, we're going to have sex. Well, that means fill in the blank.
Right.
And that alone, especially if you've had some trouble there or it feels discordant, like that's not what I feel like doing or can comfortably do, well, therefore, I'm saying no. So if we look for our yes, we can usually find it if it's about a moment to moment kind of checking in and going toward pleasure and going toward exploration. And we might spend a long time nuzzling, a chin in a neck and enjoying the ripples through our body or playing with our fingertips or stroking one part or breathing together or rocking together or smelling each other. When we start to bring all of our senses in, we can have an amazing experience that doesn't even involve the genitals necessarily, doesn't have to lead to orgasm necessarily. So this kind of attuned embodied approach actually I think is great on the front end.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess if they trip over something, right, then you stop and study and share, right? So these go together that way. Okay.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
you keep mentioning retreats and you have a book. So I want to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about, what you have to offer, where people can find these things, so where they can learn more if they want to dive deeper.
Well, thanks. So I have been offering retreats with my husband, who's also a psychologist and couples therapist, since 2010 in the US and internationally in Europe, Australia, New Zealand. And we, until now, have always done those retreats live. And the Awakened Intimacy series has 4 different parts. The first 2 need to be taken consecutively to build the core skills. And then people can take the final 2 in any order. So we are now bringing our retreats into the virtual retreat space. I don't know when this is going to air, so people can certainly look on the website to see what's offered when they're hearing it, but we are offering something later this month, possibly in February. And then my book, as you know, came out in October, and there's a lot of great exercises and reflection questions, and the terminology is defined. So those are some things that people can take advantage of if this kind of practice is appealing.
Great. And what's your website?
This one's easy. Well, maybe not. I haven't said passion and presence enough. Passionandpresence.com.
Okay. I'll put it in the show notes too, but give you, in case anybody isn't going to look that up, I want to make sure they hear it.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much I had more questions for you, but we can't cover everything. So I'm so glad we got to dive into this and that you took the time to be on the show.
I love your curiosity, and I've loved this conversation, and I've enjoyed every one of your podcasts. So it's a thrill to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.